Welcome to our IHRM webinar. I'm Maral Muratbekova, a professor at the ECP Business School, Paris campus. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. And this webinar is part of the IHRM webinar series, which is organized by Mila Lazarova from Simon Fraser University, Elaine Farndell from Penn State, my colleague Marion Festing and myself from ECP Business School, and Miguel Olivas from Penn State West University. We are also grateful for the technical support we received from Cara Adrian at Penn State University. Thank you for making this webinar run smoothly. This webinar series began back in 2020 during the COVID era, and here we are today hosting our 33rd session. So we are delighted to continue this initiative, especially as our recorded sessions have many views and positive feedback. These recordings provide valuable resources, and if you haven't already, I encourage you to check them out on our YouTube channel. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Elaine Farndale, who is a professor of HRM and director of the School of Labor and Employment Relations at Penn State University. She is also the founder and director of the Center for International Human Resource Studies, and she has been instrumental in shaping this IHRM webinar series from the very beginning. Her research spans the broad field of strategic and international IHRM, and she has made significant contributions to the field through her extensive publications. Elaine has served as a co-editor-in-chief for the Human Resource Management Journal, co-editor for the Routledge's Global HRM series, and associate editor for both Human Resource Management and the International Journal of HRM. So with over 100 scholarly articles, book chapters, and books published, her work has had a profound impact on HRM research globally. So Elaine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maral, and welcome everybody to this webinar. So I'm going to talk about the multiple contexts of human resource management. And this basically, it's a bit of an accumulation of my own learning experience from being a scholar in the HR field for, I don't know, about 20 plus years now. I stopped counting a little while ago. But essentially, what I'd like to go through with you is what I've learned over time around the essential role of context. Managing people never happens in a vacuum, in any place, any location, any time. So what I'm going to try to unpack today is something about the journey of how I see HRM field has developed in being able to incorporate context, and ending up with what I argue is an appropriate or interesting way forward for future research. And that is to have this focus on what I call institutional multiplicity. So I will talk more about that as we go forward. So just to start things off, at the very basic level, what is context? I always revert to Wetton's 2009 quote, basically saying, context is the set of factors that surround a phenomenon that exerts a direct or indirect influence on it. And now when we're talking about work and employment, human resource management, then there are a number of different factors that can affect that phenomenon that we're looking at. So these can be at the organizational level, national, international, institutional, cultural, many different layers of context, basically. And examples, typical examples are, who is in the workforce? What is management's philosophy? What's the role of trade unions? What are business conditions like? What's the labor market like? What legislation is there in place around employment? What societal values do people hold? All of these things are the context in which we manage people. So just a couple of quick examples, just to make this as clear as I can at the moment. So if we look at these two large organizations, Google and Walmart, highly successful organizations, but instantly we know Google as one of those revered places to work for. It looks like great fun to be there. All of our students want to work there because it's that nice high-tech, vibrant environment. It's all about autonomy, creativity, innovation, and they employ a very highly educated workforce and then give them these freedoms in order to be a highly successful and innovative firm. If we look at Walmart, I think that's probably it is the biggest retailer, if not one of the most successful organizations on the planet, but it is a very, very different place. Most employees are hourly paid people, and the emphasis is on keeping costs low, making sure that everything is as efficient as possible. And they're not hiring the most educated, high earning people who want a lot of autonomy. They're employing people and putting HRM practices in place that ensure that they're able to maintain cost efficiency above all. So just by looking at these two different industry contexts, we've got high tech and retail. It's very difficult to talk about HRM without putting context around it. It doesn't make sense that Google and Walmart would have the same HRM practices in place. But the interesting thing is why they're different, how they're different and why they're different. So that's at the industry level, but we can look at national level. This is the International HRM webinar series. So if we start looking at national contexts and comparing those, it takes me back to a study that I did a few years ago when I was talking with a multinational company about how they did performance appraisal. And I was lucky enough to visit their operations in Germany and visit their operations in China, and basically collecting data on how the performance management system was being rolled out. And the interesting thing that I learned there, in Germany, they were really keen to make sure that they had all the correct conversations with the different employees, sitting down for regular meetings, giving feedback, looking for lots of different sources of information. But then when I spoke with the equivalent people in China, they were much more focused on making sure that they provided the right information for head office, what they were expecting to see in the performance management system. But they were doing it without actually having the conversations with the individuals. So the end result was the same. The performance management process was complete as far as the headquarters was concerned. But the actual process, how employees were involved, what managers did, was very, very different between these two contexts. So again, we can't talk about HRM being the same. It is contextually dependent. So I started talking a little bit there about process, but let's just go back one step. So human resource management, when I first started in this field, and what a lot of people, when they're just training to become HR practitioners, maybe through a professional body, they're focused on content. So we learn about training and reward, performance management, selection, recruitment, all those, the core elements, the content of human resource management. But we tend to learn about them in very universal ways, like this is the best way to do selection, or this is the best way, to reward people. The next kind of point of learning that I went through was to discover HRM process. So HRM process is thinking about, okay, we've got this content, we've got these practices, but how they're actually implemented in the organization and how employees experience them can lead to different outcomes. So now we might be looking at performance management as a content, but how do the managers carry it out? In China and in Germany, they did it in different ways. And we would look at the outcomes of those different processes. But then the next layer on top of that is the context piece. So far, it's just been about the practices and the people involved. But, the HRM arena is larger than that. HRM happens within an organizational unit, inside an organization, inside a region or an industry, inside a country, inside the globe at a certain point in time. So all of these contextual factors can affect how content and process ultimately lead to whatever outcomes we're interested in exploring. So this kind of takes us back to the beginning of in the 1980s, when we had the Harvard model and the Michigan model, like the basis of strategic human resource management. These models were very clear on the role of context. So for the Harvard model, we can see the context is around stakeholder interest and situational factors. They affect the HRM policy choices, which affect HRM outcomes, which affect long-term consequences. If we look at the Michigan model, inside the triangle, we have the mission and strategy of the firm, the organization structure, and the human resource management, the systems that we have in place. But outside the triangle, we have cultural forces, political forces, and economic forces, the context. What happened when these models first came out, people were really interested in how HR makes a difference in organizations. All the emphasis went to the center of these models. So in other words, in the Michigan model, everyone's interested in looking at inside the triangle, and the outside of the triangle was basically forgotten about. Harvard model, the same. It's all about looking at HR, what HR policy decisions are made, what practices do we put in place, and what HR outcomes do they lead to. We're not too interested in all this noisy stuff outside, the situational factors or these economic or political or cultural forces, because that's messy. That's really difficult to actually explore. So for a long time, we've focused on these kind of the inner model, but not the whole of the model. So my argument essentially is something that is kind of I've been forcing myself to do over time, is to adopt more of a contextual paradigm. It's not easy, it's messy, but it's valuable. So basically looking at HRM practice, get rid of the idea that there's a best practice HRM, because that really is more of a myth than a reality, and start to think of how HR fits in a context. And there are two well-known ways of addressing this. So we have theories in context and theories of context. So theories in context is basically saying we have an existing theory. So let's take social exchange theory, for example. Many of us use that theory about employees will reciprocate if given good treatment from an HR perspective. But let's think about, does that hold in every single context around the world? We can refine existing theory by testing that theory in a novel context. What are the boundary conditions of that theory? And that is a big contribution, that we can actually set boundary conditions. It works in X context, but it doesn't work in another context. That gives us, better theory, better ability to understand what's going on. Theories of context are much more difficult to come up with, because basically they are new theories. This is how to develop new theory. So we start with the context, we start with a very deep understanding of the context, that from that we're able to construct a theory that may hold across different settings. I'm going to talk a little bit then about how we've used different theorizing to incorporate context in HRM research to date. So the cross-cultural management field is probably the best known. And to be honest, it's one of those that you kind of jump to as a junior scholar, because a lot of cross-cultural management research or cross-cultural HRM research uses scores and things for culture by Hofstadter or Globe or Schwartz or any of these frameworks that we have, because a lot of the time they give us a number. They say the US scores 6 on this and Germany scores 24. So we know Germany's higher on whatever it is, and the US is lower. So maybe we can throw that into an equation and come up with some kind of outcome to understand the context through those numbers. So just an example on the screen here is the Nordic model. We know that in Nordic countries, Sweden and Norway, we're looking at a culture in which there's a strong focus on welfare and egalitarianism. And in that context, there are certain systems put in place which mean that people are paying high taxes, but as a result of those high taxes that are being paid, the government's able to provide free education, free healthcare, different welfare schemes. So all of that is a model that works together. So cultural values intertwine with the institutions that are put together. And then we start to understand this Nordic model. But the Nordic model is very different from the US model, for example. The US model is much more on low taxes, but then you don't get the services as such from government through that process. So a lot of research has kind of taken that at that high level, we say cultures distilled down to a national level score. It's easily generalized, easy to compare. But what we need to be thinking about is more indigenous perspectives. So rather than asking questions from an outside perspective, so in other words, thinking about this is how we do it in the US, do you do it like that? How is it different in Germany, what you're doing, compared to how we do it in the US? That's one way of asking a question. An indigenous way of asking the question is ignore the bit about how is it done in the US and just start from the ground in Germany to understand how people think, believe, what their values are. That is a much more, a deeper way of understanding culture and values, but it's messy again, and it doesn't give us a nice number at the end that we can throw into an equation and do a comparison. So it's generally not being used as much, but potentially has a lot more has a lot more potential for future research if we start developing more of these indigenous perspectives. So if we want to incorporate context, how do we do that theoretically? There are three basic options, aside from just ignoring context altogether. But if we accept context is interesting, there are three options. First thing we can do is control context away. Second is variable-oriented theorizing. And the third is context-dependent theorizing. I'll talk a bit about each. So controlling context away is better than just pretending it doesn't exist at all. But you're essentially saying, I'm not interested in context. I know it's there, but I'm not interested in exploring it. It's not part of my research question. I'm going to hide it away in a corner somewhere. So the researcher controls statistically for whether elements of the context influence the dependent variable. And we just, move that to one side and then get on with what we're actually focusing on researching. If we, on the other hand, actually want to understand how context is affecting something, then our first port of call is often variable-oriented theorizing. So this essentially explains the effects of context on whatever we're studying, the phenomenon we're studying, and is usually based in a positivist ethic approach. So now we're thinking about, okay, context matters, but we're trying to develop some generalizable knowledge. So can we find a way to show that this particular element of context, so this, say, cultural values, have this generalized effect across these different phenomena or these different locations or these across time, whatever it is that we're trying to look at. So essentially what we're trying to do with variable-oriented theorizing is isolate certain elements of context to hypothesize relationships. So this positivist base, there's an objective, researcher-independent world. The goal of our theories is to explain or reflect that world through models. And the theoretical models specify the relationships between variables, often expressed graphically. So we have a box and we have arrows. And we're interested in working out the relationship between those boxes and how strong those arrows are. Is it positive? Is it negative? And all of this is about testing existing theory. So this is theories in context, trying to establish whether we can set the boundary conditions. So I'll give you a couple of examples here. So the first one is context as a direct predictor, so a main effect of HRM variables. So looking at the work here by Gomez and colleagues from 2000, they explored the impact of collectivism and in-group, out-group membership on the evaluation generosity of team members. So the context that they were interested in, the variable that they chose to include was individualism or collectivism, the in-group, out-group membership piece. And that is used as a discrete variable in isolation from other potential contextual influences. So we're just interested in looking at how culture, in this case, collectivism, affects the variables of interest. So a direct main effect on HRM variables. This is in the positivist model where we can really focus. But context as a direct predictor can also be much more complex than this. So the work by Kaufman in 2015, he focused on getting us more aware of the multiple levels of context. So theorizing determinants of employee voice, an integrative model across disciplines and levels of analysis. So basically looking at how to incorporate contextual determinants at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. I think basically the work that Kaufman was presenting here was very, it's ahead of its time. And some of the things that he was asking us to do are just really, really difficult to do. So it's relatively easy for us to measure that one piece of context, collectivism, and throw it into our model. It's much more difficult to incorporate all these multiple levels of analysis. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. So it's a good paper to have a look at if you want to see more insight in that area. Looking at the next step, rather than the direct effect, now we can look at context as a moderator or mediator. So now we're looking at, not the direct, but this kind of influence on a relationship. So Lam and colleagues in their study from 2002, they found differential moderating effects of culture dimensions on relationships between perceived justice and various outcomes. So they were looking at power distance and trying to explore and power distance and individualism and seeing whether that moderated, and some does moderate and some doesn't moderate. So we know that context matters, we know that culture matters, but a little bit more refined in the different types of culture and the different effects that it has. So those are just some examples of where context makes a difference. We also have examples here, Das Malchen, excuse me, where it doesn't necessarily have an effect. So in other words, their concluding sentence in the abstract there is that in markedly different countries, we find combinations of complementary high-performance work systems and bundles of ability, motivation, opportunity practices. They appear to outweigh the influence of societal culture and enhance organizational performance. So here, we're interested in context, but we've actually found that context doesn't make a difference, which is a great, contribution as well, alongside, setting the boundary conditions of existing theory. So there was a few examples of variable-oriented theorizing. I just want to talk a bit now about context-dependent theorizing. So context-dependent theorizing is done much less frequently. So this is about the researcher becoming intimately familiar with the setting under study, and the aim is to understand context as a shaper of meaning. So yes, this is interpretivism. This is an emic, an inside approach. We're not talking here about qualitative positivism. So qualitative positivism, can't say that word, qualitative Positivism basically says we do qualitative research, it helps us to build some hypotheses, and then we go and test that with quantitative data so that we get to that generalizable outcome. Instead, interpretivism, or the context-dependent theorizing, our objective is to determine to what extent the meaning assigned to certain HRM practices by the subjects studied, by the people involved, is deeply affected and influenced by context. So in other words, you're trying to uncover from individuals how context is shaping how they see the world. So you don't put your own assumptions about context in there. You don't say, oh, you come from a collectivist society, so this is how you see the world. Now tell me about HRM. No, it's tell me about HRM. Tell me about the practices you're experiencing, and why do you think that you experience them in this way? Can you tell me, things that are valuable to you? Yeah, it's that ground up approach to understanding how meaning is shaped by context. So one excellent example of work that is published in this area is by Ponash and Zaragoza-Berti from 2020. And they question the traditional theoretical assumptions about international mobility compensation. And they study this in a social enterprise. And they are asking the individuals about their experiences, their thoughts, their values, the assumptions that are coming from the bottom up. And that helps us to question extant theory in this area. So we're avoiding imposing existing conceptual frameworks, and we're listening to people, and we're interpreting what those people are saying from through their eyes, rather than trying to understand it through our own eyes. But very little research gets published in this way, largely because it often doesn't get through the review process, because many of us, I'll say I'm included myself as well, have a positivist background, and we're trained as researchers in that way, and have that, when we're doing reviews of articles that we, that are submitted to journals, we need to be very careful that we're not trying to put our lens on a paper that has been developed from a different lens. So making sure we have the right paper, only agree to review a paper if it really is in your wheelhouse, that you do understand the methodology and everything that's been involved. So that was the cross-cultural side of things. That's where contextual HRM really started and has developed most, because largely of the availability of scores for culture that allow us to do that variable-oriented theorizing. Institutions are gradually becoming more interesting, or researchers are finding them more interesting to incorporate in HR studies. But most of the time, this is done through neo-institutional theory. So neo-institutional theory is basically saying there are coercive, mimetic, normative pressures in the external context. So things like laws and professional body guidelines, and the best practice as such of competitors who are doing really well in the field. And all of those things, those institutions, affect how we're going to do HR in our organization. But what I'm sharing here are 3 additional institutional theory bases that I suggest we might be able to incorporate in the into our international HRM research. So the first of these is organizational institutionalism. And essentially what that looks at is how shared meanings become institutionalized inside an organization. So neo-institutional theory is generally looking outside organizations, what's happening outside that affects what's going on inside. Organizational institutionalism, what's happening inside the organization. How do routines, social structures, processes, things become institutionalized? Related to this is institutional logics. And institutional logics is about how the actors, managers, employees, how they transfer these organizational, institutionalized processes to different locations. So transferring how HR is done in one country to another country through management practice. So managers are talking to people, they're practicing things, and how that transfers institutions across borders. And then the final one here is comparative institutionalism, whereby there are multiple possible configurations of the national context. And what that basically is saying is external, what are the institutions, the configurations of those institutions, the complementarities between those institutions, and the density of ties, so how dependent is the organization on that external context. If we put all that together, we get different levels of interdependencies. So one organization is more embedded in a particular context compared to another organization in that same context. So just a few ideas there of theories we may want to look into from the institutional perspective. The final element of context that I want to introduce here is timing. And temporal theorizing is very, very much in a nascent stage. There's been a couple of articles just come out recently that are talking more generally about timing and the influence of time on management research in general, but not a lot is happening in the HRM space. Yet it's absolutely critical. It's just as important as culture or institutions. So what do I mean by timing? And talking about eras, critical events, grand challenges. We know that we have been through some major changes very recently, and we're still going through major changes. So these exogenous shock events, these external things happening outside organizations, economic crises, environmental disasters, pandemics, war, we can see a direct effect on HRM. So we need to be studying it, in that era, that moment, that grand challenge. So, for example, in 2008, the global financial crisis hit. And one of the main things we saw from an HR perspective was a decline in training and development. The budgets were cut. Global mobility was cut right the way back. Everyone was kind of called home. No, businesses didn't have any money anymore. And it's fairly common in that context that training and development, it gets cut at that point in time. So, it has that context, the time, 2008, impacted training and development very directly. More recently, we know the pandemic, we had that a huge effect on people and organizations. In the US, there's a lot of talk of the Great Resignation. People took the time to think about, what do we want out of life? Do I enjoy my job? Do I still want to commute anymore? Can I work from home? So it changed the employment relationship overnight almost. And those are some of the issues that we need to really, address in our HR research. One theory that I think is very helpful for doing this temporal theorizing is event systems theory. So event systems theory is a way of looking at individual events, so some of these exogenous shocks, and exploring them in terms of their strength, their space, how broad an impact they have, and the timing, so that we can really unpack how these temporal events actually affect the phenomenon, so HRM in this case. So I want to make a strong case for thinking more about timing within our context. It doesn't have to be about legislation or culture. Timing is equally important here. So pulling these ideas together, I'm arguing for something that I call institutional multiplicity. And this terminology came from the international business area, where you read a lot about institutional duality. which is all about how the host and the home locations, so the global and the local, the tensions and the ways that we need to look at things from these two different perspectives. So I'd say that we need to go beyond that institutional duality and think more about institutional multiplicity. And in doing so, we're looking at the different HRM systems that are in place. So every HR practice exists within an HRM system. So there are other HR practices with which it needs to interact. That those HRM systems sit in a strategy, a strategic direction of the organization. So there are certain goals that we're trying to achieve with those HRM systems. They exist within an organizational context. In other words, the different infrastructure, the systems, processes, people, everything that's inside the organization. And all of that exists within a national context. When we start looking at legislation, the role of the government, labor unions, then an international context, how does that compare between countries? And then all of this within a temporal context as well. So at what era are we in? Are there major events happening right now that are affecting these HRM practices that are underlying these multiple levels of institutions, of context? One way to address that, because that's really difficult to do research that covers all that, but one thing that I found helpful was to think about this from a coevolution theory perspective. This is essentially, if you start with institutional isomorphism, so in this institutional isomorphism, we're saying that there are things outside the organization that affect how we operate inside the organization. So legislation, for example. And then managerial intentionality is all about the decisions that managers make based on the institutions that they face. But all of this is also aligned with environmental determinism. In other words, there are some things that are going to happen anyway. There is legislation that requires us to operate in a very specific way, and there's non-negotiable piece. So there's something that's determined. There's a general trend of looking more alike, the isomorphism idea, and there are managers making decisions. And coevolution theory asks you to look at all these three things alongside each other for whatever phenomenon it is that you're trying to explore. So if you're looking at, well, I'll give you an example actually here. There's an example by Lahiri and Kedia in 2011. They use coevolution theory to explore offshore outsourcing. So how organizations decide whether to outsource offshore and outsource their activities. And they explore both internal organizational factors and external institutional factors at the same time, so that we have a better understanding of these decisions that are being made, rather than trying to do them separately. So this coevolution theory, the fact that one influences the other, what's happening inside the organization affects what happens outside, and what happens outside the organization affects what happens inside the organization. So yeah, another recommendation for incorporating context, coevolution theory can be highly useful. So pulling these ideas together, ultimately, when we design our research, we choose what we want to hear. We decide whether we're positivist or interpretivist. We decide whether we're imposing our voice or we're listening to other voices. We can decide if context is a variable of interest for us or something that we want to control for, not ignore, but control for and move to one side so we can focus on what we're interested in. Most of the time, we're still looking at quantitative research, but context makes qualitative research even more interesting to explore, because that's how we get to understand context, to really do that qualitative work that's deep, rich, so that we can understand that context better. And this brings us to this kind of ultimately, we need this institutional multiplicity, or I think what people have called polycontextuality is a very similar idea. So polycontextuality, give you an example here. So this was something published by Joshi and Rowe in 2009. The role of context in work team diversity research, a meta-analytic review. So this study manages to integrate macro and micro theoretical perspectives, simultaneously to help to account for multiple levels of context. So they're talking about, I think it's a team level, industry level, occupational level. So by having all of these factors together, they were able to explain more of the variance in the phenomena that they were exploring. Just doing any on its own doesn't explain as much variance. By the time you put these together, then you can start to make a real difference. So polycontextuality, institutional multiplicity, having these multiple levels is key to the approach. So overall, essentially what we're talking about here is open systems theorizing. There are contextual contingencies. There's stuff happening in the context that affects the way that we do HR. And ultimately, that has an impact on employee attitudes and behaviors. So it's an open system where HR is affected by things from outside, processes happen, and an output is created as a consequence of that content, the processes, and the context. So where does this leave us? We're arguing that, one of the questions that we're still left with is, why is universalist or context-free knowledge generally considered superior to localized or context-sensitive knowledge in the HR field? Things are changing, but it's still easier to get something published that's more universalist and generalizable than something that's deeply embedded in a local context. And consequently, I ask the question, are extant theories sufficient to investigate context fully, or do we need novel context-sensitive theory to move us forward? Do we need to go and develop some of these theories of context to help us dig deeper into this field? So just to conclude, basically, context is our friend. It's not an inconvenience. It helps us to create our next research question. There are so many contexts out there. We've got an endless amount of work to do going forward. But the extent to which we explicitly incorporate context in our HRM research, the closer we come to uncovering the reality of organizational life. This really is about, how do we understand better human resource management, especially on the international scale. That was my presentation, and I will hand back to Morale if there are questions.
Thank you, Elaine. It was super interesting and very insightful. I liked very much your call for qualitative research, actually, because being myself a qualitative researcher, I appreciate it very much that you are spreading the word about this. We don't have questions, so I will ask the first questions by myself, but please, those who are there, and if you have questions, post them in the Q&A. So my question is, so you talked about the difficulty to publish the context papers. So what would be your advice when, for example, many PhD students that I see at the conferences or even at our business school, they come to me and say, okay, I'm, let's say, from Vietnam, Lebanon, or, so-called small countries. And my supervisor pushes me to work on, let's say, US context, because nobody would be interested what's happening in Vietnam, Lebanon, or I don't know. I'm from Kazakhstan, etc. And I say that you know your context better. So instead of speaking about someone else, so how would you, what would you tell them?
Thank you, Maral. That is something that has frustrated me for a long time. Because at a certain point, I realized that, so I'm kind of from a privileged situation in as much as I am from the UK originally. I'm a native English speaker. I've been in the US a long time, doing research here as well. And all of those factors give me an unfair advantage. Because if I want to do some research in the US and I submit that to a journal, I don't need to say I did this in the US. I don't say where I've done it, but nobody's going to question or anything about, well, is this interesting? But if I go and I do a study, or somebody else, if someone's in Croatia and they do a study of Croatia and they submit that paper to a journal, the instant reaction is, do we care what's happening in Croatia? Now, my frustration has always been, why don't we say, do we care what's happening in the US, or do we care what's happening in the UK, or wherever? Because level playing field, we shouldn't, if we're asking one question, we should be asking it elsewhere. But what I've kind of found over time, the biggest problem is usually that when that question is being raised, it's because context hasn't been theorized. So if you say, okay, I did this study in Croatia and this is what I found, but you don't actually talk about the Croatian context, it's just like incidental, I did it in Croatia. And that immediately makes people go, well, do I care what's going on in Croatia? I should. I hope you would. But there's that, well, that's in Croatia, it's this tiny country. What relevance does that have to anybody else around the world? Well, the answer is theorize the context, because then everyone will know what impact that is having on others. It's a boundary condition for an existing theory, or you're building new theory from that context. And that's the piece that is usually missing. So it doesn't matter where you're doing research, be it a small country, a big country, if context matters, then context should matter. In other words, it should be in the research question. It should be in the theorizing. If you're using hypotheses, it should be in the hypotheses. And then you can discuss the impact of it also, in your discussion and the contributions and things that you're making. So that helps to bridge this, well, why does it matter piece? Theorize it, and then it matters. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Lenny. I completely agree. So actually you have to step back from, to create something bigger than just the context theorizing. Raccoon asks, what are some undervalued or less well-studied contextual factors that you find interesting and worth exploring?
Understudied. I mean, there's a huge list, because it's virtually everything that isn't culture, because everything is understudied. Culture, say, because of it, these handy scores as such that we have, it gets used a lot. But in the majority of contexts, we don't understand how external and internal contexts interact. So rather than just taking an individual context, I think the thing that is missing most is understanding how what's going on outside of the organization is interpreted by the people inside the organization and the institutions that are then built internally, that in turn also have an effect on those external institutions. So, for example, a government introduces new regulations about flexible working. Say, at a national level, there's some new legislation that is designed to help give people better flexible working situations. So that's something that's been imposed externally at a certain point in time. So we can start to explore why was it imposed, why was that introduced at this particular time, thinking about the time context, what was the relevance there. But then inside the organization, what is the reaction to that? So then we're thinking about, is that sort of, well, we were doing it anyway, so let's just carry on, or this is a huge difference for us, we need to do something differently, introduce new policies and practices, or excuse me, or we're going to fight this, we don't want to do this, we don't agree that it belongs in our organization. And studying who is making those decisions, why are they making the decisions that they're making, and then looking at the impact of those decisions. So if we have a load of organizations that really don't like that legislation, and then the managers are making decisions about not implementing things or only implementing very baseline rights, that can then influence the government that introduced this legislation in the first place. And this is the whole co-evolution theory arguments. So I think rather than picking on specific context things, it's more the interaction between elements of the context that is really understudied. And that's, it's difficult, it's hard to be able to capture all of that, but that's what's interesting. That's, being able to see how the different things interact with each other.
Yeah. I like this very much as well. And you also talked about event system theory. Do you have an example of a paper? What type of event was studied apart from COVID?
Yes.
Because we have a lot of things on COVID.
There's plenty on COVID. But so event systems theory, we published something in the Journal of Management. I think it came out last year. Yeah. But basically, what we were looking at there was changes happening inside an organization as a consequence of something that happens outside, and ultimately, how does that affect the IHRM role? So we looked across multiple organizations, those that had suffered major shocks or scandals. So there's some fraud case, some mis-selling, the company or somebody in the company did something wrong. There's external stakeholders found out about that, and bad publicity, poor reputation, all of these things. And then the organization has to quickly scramble and recover from the scandal, the event that happened. So one of the things that we were looking at is, it talks about the strength, the time, and the space of these events. So how impactful is the scandal? What is the scope of it? Who is involved? All these different things. And then ultimately, how does HR help the organization to recover from that scandal event? So I'm afraid you asked me for an example and you got one of my own, but
yeah. No, that's great, because I thought, like, apart from COVID, what could be? But yeah, it's like inside, outside, there are many things. Mila asks, how do we teach this in the classroom? So outside academia, to MBA students, for example. So what warning signs, if any, do we give students when we teach general HR or universalistic HR? Should an HR class in Kazakhstan be very different than HR class in Norway or in Ghana or in Kenya? We have an attendee from Kenya who thanks you very much, by the way, for a great discussion.
That's a really good question. And it depends on what level we're talking about, because at the content level, we can be universal in as much as we can talk about there is a way to recruit people. And what does that involve? So we go through the different steps of how do we advertise a position? How do we, go through when we get to selection, choosing people? Should we do interviews? Shouldn't we do, all these different content pieces. If you're starting at the very beginning, that's where you need to start. You need to understand those basic functions of human resource management. But the piece that is often missing from teaching, and certainly, so when I first graduated, I went into an HR role, and I was following the professional body, their education program to get certified. And I don't believe anywhere in that at that time was there any question of there could be different ways of doing this. So it was always presented as, if you want to get the best out of people, you need to pay for performance. Let's just use that as an example. In order to get the highest performance out of people, you need to pay them based on how well they are performing. And that was, that's it. That's the best practice. That's the way that you should do these things. And that's the way that it was taught. But we should be introducing the idea that when we're thinking about pay for performance, what factors make pay for performance work? So we need to ask more why questions. So we're being told, okay, this is a good practice. Why is it a good practice? And then we can start unpacking, in the classroom, getting people to think, well, why is this going to work? And hopefully people can think about, motivation theories and various things like that. But if you've got a more diverse classroom, or you've got an environment where pay for performance actually feels uncomfortable, then those are the conversations that are just going to be really valuable, because you can look at that and start to say, okay, I understand the principle that the better I perform, the more that I earn. But why does that work? Because for me personally, it might be that I don't want to earn more than the next person or the person next to me, because I know they've contributed as well. So I don't want more pay than them. They deserve as much pay as me. So asking those why questions, rather than just accepting that, yeah, this is a way we should probably do this, that to me is the way that we get in the classroom to think about context.
Thank you, Ellen. Why and how maybe questions as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was super useful, very interesting and insightful. So before we finish our webinar, I wanted to repeat again, this talk is a part of series, and the next one is scheduled on April 3 with Helen Tenzer. It would be also very interesting. Also, please see the announcements that Kara posted on the chat for the conferences, one of which is in Dubai in October, and the submission deadline is in July, I think 1st of July, and another one in South Africa, and you have to submit it very fast, actually. So you see the thing. So Elaine, big thanks to you once more, and also to all colleagues who are involved in organizing this webinar, and of course to all the participants. So we hope you found it interesting and useful, and see you again next time in April 3, for example. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.